This programme is sponsored by Mousemesh. Mice get into your home via the air bricks. Mousemesh is a humane alternative to preventing mice and other unwanted guests from entering your home.
Welcome to RichPlanet TV. I'm Richard D. Hall. It really is difficult to keep up with all of the alleged carnage being reported in mainstream media recently. My advice is don't believe any of it unless you are 100% sure you have seen solid evidence of every single claim. I communicated with Neil Sanders recently, and he has reported on a GCHQ policy which sets out a strategy to plant false stories on the internet with the aim of misleading researchers. In other words, your government is using your taxes to mislead you. Now, today I am launching a new film on DVD which can be pre-ordered from the website for dispatch on the 8th of August 2016. Unfortunately, I cannot say what the film is about. What I can say is it is 93 minutes long, it is not a new Madeline film, and it is not about UFOs, but that really is all I can say. All will become clear when you watch it. So if you want to order the mystery film for dispatch on the 8th of August, please follow this link. All will be revealed then. As many viewers know, I have researched the Mars rover program with a very critical eye, and I conclude that the evidence does not convince me that the Mars rovers are on Mars. I suspect they may have never left the Earth. I recently spent some time updating my hypothesis document, which is now some 100 pages long. On today's show, I discussed the new hypothesis with Andrew Johnson. The jury is very much still out on this one. Warning. This show has quite a high nerd rating. But that's okay, because I suspect there are many RichPlanet viewers who might be described as closet nerds. We've discussed some of NASA's projects at length on RichPlanet in previous shows, including the Mars rover program. These are unmanned robots which, according to NASA, are roaming around the surface of Mars and occasionally sending back pictures. In 2014, I published a paper entitled The Mars Rover Hypothesis, which examines whether or not the Mars rovers really are on Mars and evidence suggesting they possibly never left the Earth. I have recently updated the hypothesis with significant new evidence, and here to discuss the work is RichPlanet stalwart Andrew Johnson. Welcome, Andrew.
Thanks for inviting me, Richard.
Now then, when I put this hypothesis out, and people can see our interviews from these links on the screen, and they can download the new hypothesis from the link on the screen, I was contacted by two scientists, and they went through a lot of the evidence in the document, and they were casting doubt over a lot of the evidence. So what we're going to do first is just look at some of the evidence that we put forward, or I put forward, also to mention Douglas Gibson. He's been involved in this research as well. That we think now is probably not so strong, or has been taken out of the hypothesis altogether. Because I've listed some of the evidence that's been removed from the hypothesis because it's effectively been explained. The first was the moving artifacts image. This was a photograph, we can see it here in the image, where it appeared that some of the rocks were in different positions in different images. And it was shown fairly easily that this was just due to parallax, a parallax problem with the camera. The other piece of evidence, which I've completely removed from the hypothesis, was an image called the self-portrait of curiosity.
Yes.
And this is because the image, it does seem to have been stitched together from a mosaic of lots of other images.
Yes.
So what was suggested was, well, how could something possibly take a photograph of itself?
Yes.
Now, perhaps still in the ambiguous category, but I've moved these two images to the appendix, so they're not part of the main hypothesis, but I've left them in there. The first one is the piece of wood image, which I know that you're familiar with.
Yes, indeed.
So if you just remind us about that image, Andrew.
Yes, well, I mean, when I first saw this image a few years ago, it did, to me, look like a plank of wood, basically, that had kind of partly rotted, and that was primarily because of its shape and the texture of it and the length of it, and it did seem to have squared off edges. But I think from what you'd put in the document there are some additional segments of that same image, just I think a few sort of feet away, aren't there, where you're seeing similar features.
Yeah, so we see there a much wider image of the landscape where there appears to be other objects which have the same surface texture.
Yes.
Right, to the right there, which isn't the same shape with squared off edges. So
right. So it could just be that it's happened to be a lump of rock that's broken off of that, which looks like a 3x2 lump of wood. But again, what we can say is that we know that these rover images are capable of taking colour pictures, and this discussion that we're having now would have been aided by having a colour picture, because then if it were, we could see whether it was wood coloured or whether it was less wood coloured, but we can't because it's only black and white.
Another image which I've taken out of the main hypothesis and moved into the appendix, but still in the document, was what we've termed the walrus arm bone, which a close-up, we'll just put that on the screen, looks at first sight very much like a bone. Again, one of the scientists that contacted me actually did a calculation on the size, and he pointed out quite rightly that one of the first things you should try and do is ascertain what is the size of the thing that you're looking at.
Yes, indeed, yeah.
And he did that by looking at the imprints of the tyres, well, they're not tyres, the wheels.
The wheels, yeah, with
of the rover.
Yeah.
75 millimeters, as we see there. So the item in the image there is probably, maybe I would say, less than 7.5 centimeters long. So it's not
big enough for a
to
leg
be
joint
to
of
be
a
a
walrus.
walrus. So, and he actually said in his text, and don't even go down the avenue of calling it a baby seal bone, right? But if we look at a wider shot of that, I think I'm inclined to accept this, that there are lots of fragments of rocks of all different kinds of random shapes, and they clearly are rocks in that image. So I'm happy to accept that may just be a rock and not a bone. So as I say, they've been moved into the appendix. There's many changes to this document. Some of it as a result of the information given to me by these two scientists. I've added some new sections into the hypothesis, Andrew. I'll just run through them. Microbial life images, ventifacts and unexplained features, sand dunes, LiDAR, radio signals, and the landing. Another thing that I've taken out is I was comparing the Spirit and Opportunity rovers with a mobility scooter. And it was pointed out that, well, mobility scooters are designed to travel several miles in one charge, whereas the rover will only go a few meters. It moves very short distances. Now, there's a lot of hardware on these rovers, and if you were to operate them all simultaneously, it would be quite a load, but I understand that it's done in a very conservative fashion. So the amount of current or power that the devices draw, including the motors on the wheels, is very small relative to a mobility scooter. So they're saying it's not a fair comparison.
Yeah.
So I've taken that comparison out. But I do still ask questions about whether the lithium-ion batteries that are on Spirit and Opportunity could have really lasted for 10 years without having significant reduction in performance.
Yes, indeed. And I mean, we can, point out that the conditions on Mars, according to what we're told, rather more hostile to battery technology than they are on Earth. So, a laptop battery, as you say, lasting 10 years on Earth. I mean, a laptop doesn't draw that much current, so but yet a laptop will only last for 5 minutes when the battery is basically no good.
Mm-hmm.
So how are these lasting on a charge from solar panels, which are that much further away from the sun, etc., etc.?
All right, well, we come to another photographic image, which is PIA 16204. And as soon as you see this image, you think, well, that's some kind of rodent. It's a lemming, or it's what have you. Now, both the scientists said that they thought it was just a rock that had caught the light in a certain way to make it look like that. Now, interestingly, one of these scientists was able to give me another high-definition image of that group of rocks on a different day, about 3 weeks apart, from a different angle. And obviously, if it's a rodent, it's not going to be there in this other image, so it should be completely absent. Now, so I've included that image in the new hypothesis. Now, it's not that straightforward, because initially this scientist, I believe he misidentified the rocks, which I put in one of my previous lectures. This is the correct identification, I believe, which is shown in these two drawings. So the important rocks are rocks 1, 2 and 3, and the anomaly is between rocks number 2 and 3. So
yes.
If we just look at this close-up image of them side by side.
Yes, and I mean, as you said in your lecture, Richard, that you do have to look at this carefully. And I was looking at this in your document when I was going through it a few days ago, and I was probably looking at this pair of images for something like 10 minutes to sort of, so I could orientate what was being illustrated in my own mind. So it's not something you can just do instantly, because as we've already said, these images were taken days apart. The rover's in a slightly different position, the light's different, the size of the rocks in each image is somewhat different. So you do have to look at the rock field fairly carefully and kind of do a bit of 3D space, analysis in your brain to work out what is being shown.
So in the image there, rock 2 is marked. That's the same rock in each image from a different angle at a different day, and also rock 3. So the question we must ask, it appears that there is sand banked up on rock number 3. Is that sand, or is it actually the back of another rock, which is making up the rock that we see in the middle, or the anomaly that we see in the middle, which looks like a rodent? Now, if you look along the profile here, the sand does seem to follow, or rock, if it's a rock, the same profile as some kind of rodent. But is that what we're looking at? Do you make a judgment, Andrew?
Well, I mean, I was, when I looked at this, and I said I did look at it for a number of minutes, and it does look like that rock, which is meant to be a rodent, has moved out of the way. I'd like to make me more comfortable in my own mind, I'd like to see some sort of computer model made, but that would probably take a couple of weeks of work at least.
Mm-hmm.
I think it'd probably be possible to do it from these images, and maybe there might be another one that could be added in. But it's a complicated process. But I would like to see that done before I was convinced. But before I was 100% convinced. But looking at the two images we have, I'd say yes, it does look like the alleged rodent does seem to be not present in the
right.
second image.
Right, and there is another more conspiratorial angle which may have happened that I suggest in the document, and that is that the first image there on the left has been released. The NASA or whoever have realised they haven't airbrushed it out, so they've deliberately taken an image from another angle, and they've made the sand look like this similar shape to create ambiguity. Now that might sound very contrived, and perhaps it is, but I just put it in there as a possibility.
Yeah. Yes.
But if it can be proven that the anomaly, which looks like a rodent on the left, definitely isn't in the second image, to me that's fairly smoke and gun evidence. But as you say, a 3D model would be useful.
Yes.
All right.
So if we've got any volunteers out there, then be our guest and
Yes.
see what you can come up with.
Yeah. Now the next image, which one of the scientists said was just geology, that these what I asserted might be some sort of vertebrae from a creature. It does look like a vertebrae, but one of the points that was noted was, well, if that's a vertebrae, what's the object at the very left of the screen there? If what's on the right of the screen is some sort of vertebrae, then is what's on the left of the screen also the remains of some animal? And if it is, what is it? Because I think he was saying, well, what's on the left there is geology, so why isn't what's on the right geology? And he also points to a wider image. This
But
one,
that argument there is somewhat weak, if you ask me, because if that is some type of fossilized animal, then it may part of it may have been washed away, in some river, or it could have been moved by some other process which has happened, wind erosion, or the rock has just split apart and fallen on top of it. So saying that bit looks like a bone and that bit next to it doesn't, therefore the whole thing isn't, to me would be a weak argument.
yeah. Well, what he said is that the whole thing is geology, and it's been made by the process of wind erosion and the creation of what they call ventifacts, which we're going to come on
about
to.
that, yeah.
And there's an image of a ventifact in the Arctic. Sorry,
Yes, and I mean you can,
Antarctic.
that almost looks like some type of skull, doesn't it, from that angle? So yes, you can see the point. But then again, we get onto the whole argument of if the atmospheric density on Mars is what is alleged to have been, there is some question as to how much erosive force would be produced by such an atmosphere.
And how much sand can that atmosphere carry?
Support, in the lower gravity. Maybe can it support more because it's lower gravity? And the atmospheric pressure is that much lower. We don't have. I don't know. Maybe there are some scientific papers on that which we haven't. And if anybody can find those and wants to send them to us, great. If it gives us more information, fantastic.
Okay. The next image is something that Douglas Gibson pointed out, which appears to show two egg-shaped objects which have perhaps been broken. And the question is, are we looking at two eggshells from eggs which have perhaps hatched open?
Possibly. I looked at this image and I felt that what was alleged to be shells looked a bit too thick to me. I certainly think the way that the sand has kind of sat in them is quite interesting. But another thought that came to my mind when looking at that particular image is if they were just fresh eggshells, they would have, and they were organic matter, they would have decayed. And I understand that fossilized eggshells are quite rare. They don't find many of them. So I don't know, maybe there's another explanation for this image, but the image itself is still quite interesting.
All right. And you would normally find eggshells in groups of 2 or 3. We've got 2 there, and they certainly look elliptical in shape rather than round.
Yes.
And it appears that in the top one, that part of the object, whatever it is broken off. The broken piece appears to be lying beside it.
Yes.
Which is what a hatched egg might look like.
Yes, but I mean, I would argue that it might have been an egg-shaped object, so that was an inorganic object, perhaps, which we seem to have several examples of in other images.
And Douglas Gibson has done a calculation of the size on that particular object, and he reckons it's about just over 4 centimetres in length, which he's saying is consistent with certain types of eggs.
Yes.
Now this is an image which was in the previous hypothesis, which was alleged to look like lichen, which is this sort of fungus type stuff which grows on rocks.
Yes.
Now what one of the scientists points out here is that if you look at that image there, you've got quite a regular circle around the central anomaly, and then further out you've got another circle. And what that's created by is an instrument on the Mars rover called the Mossbauer spectrometer. So this is a metal plate with a hole in it, a circular metal plate, which pushes down onto the surface, and it leaves the central piece in place. That has then been photographed at a later time by the microscopic imager. So the regular circular shape there has been made by the rover itself.
Right.
So really, all you're interested in is the pattern, not the fact that it's grown or appears to have grown in a circular way. Yeah.
Okay.
So you can ignore that. So you're just looking at the surface texture, and what the scientists said was that, well, that's just the surface texture of rock or sand or soil or something like that. All right.
Yes.
So he's certain that he's explained what that image is, but he admits that it does look a bit like lichen. Okay, but I've left it in there in the hypothesis there because I still think it's strong enough to be left in.
Yes, I would agree with you. I think that it does look like lichen. The pattern of the sort of the little individual strands or tendrils or whatever you would call them with lichen does match the terrestrial image.
Right, now the next section I've added, which is evidence of microbial life. Now people might say, well, this doesn't suggest that the rovers are on the Earth, because there might be microbial life on Mars. It might be suggesting that there is microbial life on Mars, and I'm open to that. Now, I've mentioned the labelled release experiment. Now, you know a little bit about that, Andrew. Just tell us about that.
Yeah, well, this experiment that was designed by Dr. Gilbert Levin, and it was flown, or allegedly flown, on the Viking 1 and 2 missions. And basically what it did was there was a mechanical arm dug into the soil on Mars, drew back the soil into the lander, deposited the dust in some type of dish, which actually had some sugars in a sugary solution, and the sugar was laced with radioactive carbon, that's carbon-14, and the experiment was that if there were any bacteria in this dust, that they should metabolize the sugars in this solution, and then they would give off carbon dioxide. But because these sugars were radioactively doped with carbon-14, then the radioactive detector would detect radioactive carbon dioxide. And indeed, this experiment did detect radioactive carbon dioxide being given off. So the only way that could happen was by the sugary solution being metabolized by bacteria in the soil.
And on both of the landers, it produced the same result for the first 2 experiments. And then, strangely, in later experiments, it didn't.
Yes, indeed. And there were other experiments, such as the pyrolytic release, which David Darling has done a good description of, which also produced a positive result for microbial life. And then there was a third experiment, which was I forget the name of this third experiment, which I think it was some type of gas chromatogram or something, and that produced a negative result. But according to what David Darling said in one of his talks, they knew that experiment didn't work even before it got to Mars, because they tested it on Earth, and even on Earth it had failed to detect.
So we think then that wherever the Viking landers were, there probably was microbes in the soil.
I would say yes.
You would say that, yeah.
Yes.
Now, later lander, the Phoenix lander, took images which have been put into a sequence of the soil, and they appear to show little mites or something crawling about.
Correct, yes, very interesting, that one, and I've shown this at a few of the talks I've given. People that have seen those might remember that. And Ron Bennett, he did a very interesting sort of experiment of his own, in that he put a lot of these images from the Phoenix lander into a time-lapse sequence. So he was able to see this apparent movement of these particles, it does seem to be consistent with the speed and the type of movement that a small bug made. And he got that. He was interviewed on CNN, this Ron Bennett chap, but he didn't work for NASA. He was an amateur researcher. So again, why weren't NASA making their own time-lapse videos? It's very strange.
What I've said in the hypothesis is Ron Bennett, because Mars has such a hostile environment which only certain types of life similar to life on Earth would be able to survive. So it has to be very hardy life that's going to survive on Mars that we're going to find. So he suggests that it's perhaps one of these tardigrades, which they've tested in zero gravity and this kind of thing, and they've got this extremely robust design whereby they can withstand extreme temperatures and very little oxygen and all this sort of stuff. So this is why he's plumped for that, and possibly also the shape of it.
Yes.
But discussed this with Douglas Gibson, and he says, well, there's a whole load of, there's thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, if not millions of different types of soil mites, right, which could also be in that image.
Yes.
And are far more common on the Earth. So is this not just a very, very common soil mite found on the Earth, rather than the exotic tardigrade suggested by the other chap who believes the craft is on Mars?
Indeed,
so
yes.
if you bring the craft to the Earth, there's a far more simple explanation for that evidence. That's what we're suggesting.
Right. And it's worth mentioning that the Phoenix lander was only functioning, I think, for about 6 months before they lost contact with it. So that again is rather, well, fortunate or unfortunate, depending on which way you look at it.
This programme is sponsored by MouseMesh. Mice can squeeze through gaps the thickness of a pencil. This simple, effective solution will not only prevent mice, it's also a barrier against wasps, bees and slugs. This programme is sponsored by MouseMesh, the humane way of keeping mice out of your home. Air brick covers come in 3 different colours and sizes, shaping the future of pest control.
Right, so we come on to the next section, which is fossil images. There is quite a large school of thought which thinks that the NASA archive does contain fossil images, and people who look at these often say, well, this is proof that there was once life on Mars. In the hypothesis, we're agreeing with the first observation that yes, there are fossils in NASA's archive.
In these images,
But this could equally mean that they've accidentally been photographed on Earth. Now, one person who's looked at this sort of evidence extensively is a guy called Charles Schultz. And he, in his book, A Fossil Hunter's Guide to Mars, makes the assertion that Mars was once full of life because it's full of fossils. And we can show some of the examples on the screen. Let me just read a few quotes from A Fossil Hunter's Guide to Mars. Charles Schultz says, "What I present here is evidence of fossilized sea life on Mars. In the course of describing these fossils, I may refer to them as sea urchins, shark's teeth, or other terrestrial forms. However, they are not. These are only structurally identical to those organisms and are not in any way related to them. It is very likely that these creatures have absolutely no genetic relationship to the creatures we have on Earth. They are simply shaped by their environment to function in the same manner as marine creatures on the Earth. If I call something on Mars a sea urchin or a trilobite, be aware that the similarity is strictly morphological and is not endorsed in any manner as a scientific proof that these fossils are from sea urchins, trilobites, or any other terrestrial organisms. Their forms are the result of the fact that form and function go hand in hand." So he's saying that they've just evolved in the same way that they did on Earth, in parallel, if you like. But what I've said in the hypothesis is, by making this statement, Schultz is showing that he is convinced the images he is examining are from Mars. If not, isn't surely the elephant in the room that he is actually looking at Earth fossils photographed on Earth? If Schultz is correct that the fossils seem identical to Earth fossils, which is what he's asserting, is it not an equally strong hypothesis that the images are from the Earth?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah.
And Schultz goes on to state, and I think this is more key, the very agencies that are proclaiming their support for the search for alien life are the same organizations that are actively discrediting the discoveries that have been made. It begs the question, why? And I've provided a possible answer to that.
Yes.
A plausible answer to that question is that the discoveries are not genuine because they're from the Earth.
Yes.
That would be a reason for not wanting to admit them.
Yes.
Now then, let's go through.
And you know, the oddity is with this whole scenario is that discovering like microbial life and little fossilized organisms on Mars seems to me like a fairly tame discovery, you know, that they should be able to announce if indeed, you know, that was what they had actually discovered. In other words, what I'm saying is I find it extremely odd that NASA would not announce the discovery of microbial life, or rather, perhaps I should correct myself, because they did announce the discovery of microbial life in 1976, but then about a year or so later, they said that the experiment was flawed and the result was wrong. So why are they being so cagey about the discovery of even microbial life? You know, you'd think that that wouldn't be a threat to anybody to say that they discovered it.
And even fossils.
Yeah.
So what? There's some fossils on Mars.
Some
There might be
fossils
life.
yeah.
Is that such a big thing to sort of want to cover up?
Right. Because fossils doesn't equal aliens. You know, it's so.
And at the very least, what they could do is all of the things that Charles Schultz has found in these images. They could hold a conference and debate it on platforms and point out all of these anomalies in the open, and then come to some conclusions.
Yes.
But they haven't done all of that.
They haven't done that. In fact, Charles Schultz has said in interviews that he was invited to conferences and then they cancelled him, or they cancelled the conference.
Right. So the image here on the screen there, many experts agree, is a crinoid fossil. And incidentally, the two scientists that looked at the document both said it looked like biology, right?
Yes.
Because they could not debunk this image, right?
Yes.
Okay, we move on to some of Charles Schultz's images.
Yeah.
So the first one here is, this is a quote from A Fossil Hunter's Guide to Mars. Marine fossils from Sol 009, microscopic imager on Opportunity. From top left is a spiral shell, broken shell showing chambers, and a scallop. From bottom left are what appears to be a shark's tooth. That's a type of shell, or, well, what is a shark's tooth? It's a remnant of biology, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah.
It's not literally a shark's tooth. It's just shaped like a shark's tooth, but it's a remnant of biology. Spiral shell, similar to a conch. These were found in Eagle Crater. But as you say, Andrew, wouldn't it be great if we had colour images and more high definition images?
Absolutely, you know, because then we'd have more data to work with. So, you know, again, there's a question mark as to why they haven't why we haven't been able to have colour images of these things.
The image on the right there, Schultz is claiming is like a sea gopher, and he's pointing out various aspects of it in that diagram. The next one is another crinoid fossil. So he's just marked out the shape there in the right-hand image. Crinoid is not a plant; it's an animal or a sea creature which swims about the sea, and you can see it there imprinted on this rock. Crinoid fossil. And further image here, this is a whelk shell, according to Charles Schultz, and he's got a close-up there. These are just a selection of images I've taken from A Fossil Hunter's Guide to Mars. Yes. Some of the ones that I found more convincing. Let me just read this. Spirit seems to be in an area that had numerous species that are very similar to terrestrial marine organisms, both past and present. There are many seashells, some apparent urchins, crinoids, stromatolites, and what may be bones of larger animals such as reptiles, although that is speculative at this time. Altogether, it creates an image of a Mars that supported a large population of diverse organisms, but in all they appear to be aquatic and not land-dwelling. This would be consistent with the thin atmosphere and poor shielding from the radiation environment. More in-depth exploration will be needed on the planet to determine what part, if any, that land organisms played in this lost ecosystem. Now, again, another possible explanation is that it's in some previous marine area on the Earth, perhaps one of the areas where rover testing has been done.
You know, and again, if you take the kind of logic that NASA wants to be self-sustaining in that it needs to attract funding for its future projects, then revealing these fossils that Charles Schultz had discovered would make a lot of sense, because that paragraph that you were reading there then kind of logically leads you on to, well, we need to have a different type of mission to specifically explore this region where the fossils are found, you know, with new experiments on board, different approach to how we would sample the soil, or, you know, dig deeper or dig more, or, you know, maybe even a sample and return mission, which has been mentioned on a couple of videos. So that presents NASA with an ideal opportunity to actually get more projects on the books and get more funding, doesn't it? So why, for their logic, why would they want to just ignore those findings?
Yeah, their mission is not to land the thing on the Martian surface when they all jump up and down and pat each other on the back. That's not the end of the mission. The mission is to look for life.
Yes.
But it seems that they're not interested in finding life.
That's what it seems like to me.
Right, now I'm going to show some unexplained or some bizarre anomalies now in some of the images. Now, whenever you get anomalies on Mars, it's explained away as event effect, which you find these on Earth. We've just seen some images there. This is where you get strong winds and sand is blown up and blows over the surface of rock, and it makes the surface smooth, and you get very rounded edges or circular holes and this kind of thing. And yes, I'm inclined to believe that some of the anomalies are vent effects.
Yes.
Now, that doesn't mean they're vent effects on Mars, though. It could mean it's an Earth vent effect.
Right.
So this image here, we see that the object in the middle there, which looks like it has sort of very regular concentric, sort of donut-shaped profile on it. I'll just give a close-up there. And we see another vent effect below, where you can see the wind has possibly eroded this piece of rock. Now, the landscape we see there in the next image also shows the same vent effect, and there's another close-up of it. These images we also featured. Gary McKinnon was talking about these images, but the next one, which is a close-up of image section A, is that a vent effect? Looks a bit peculiar. Did you read anything into that image, Andrew, the top one here?
Well, I looked at some of these and it didn't really stand out to me as anything really obvious. But, you know, I will just add that there are a number of surface anomalies which seem to show structure which doesn't appear to be geology, it's something else, you know. And Richard Hoagland has some of these on his site too, where it looks like we've got bits of machinery or something, or bits of you know, devices laying on the ground, and they are very interesting when you look at them. And even those images on Hoagland's site were from Pathfinder mission.
Right.
So yeah, there are a lot of and that's a hexagonal image you're showing there. So
yeah. So this is from Charles Schultz has pointed this out from Fossil Hunter's Guide to the Mars. I'll just give the caption. He says 3 mysteries in one shot. Top object has 5 concave sides in a perfect pentagon, and the centre has a round hole dead centre. Object is hollow and its walls wafer thin. The left pentagon object shows perfect linear edges precisely at the angles of a perfect pentagon. The bottom right object is shaped like a rind and is one of about 2 dozen that I have found. So he's saying that he thinks that this is biology. With the pentagon shape, which occurs in biology.
Yeah.
Now here's another very peculiar image. The red square there, if we just zoom in on that, answers on a postcard what this is in this image. What do you think of that one, Andrew? It's a dumbbell shape.
Yeah, I mean it's fairly indistinct. So
you don't think it's something regular which has been machined or anything like that?
Difficult to say, I think. I would say that's difficult to say myself.
All right.
But
okay, we'll move on to the next one. Now, I think this was featured in mainstream media, this particular one.
Yeah, it was. I'm pretty sure it was in the Daily Mail, yeah.
And it is a genuine Mars rover image.
Yep.
It's from the Opportunity rover, and there's a close-up. And do you think that can be passed off as geology?
Well, that's really tough. I mean, I suppose one could argue that it's a larger rock and the sun is at a certain angle and so forth. But yeah, it does look like a dome.
I've put an arrow on the right hand of the screen here just to point out that it appears to be a smaller dome.
Yes, yeah.
And the question I'm asking in the hypothesis is, could we be looking at one of these, which is the sort of accommodation units that they install in the desert or in the Canadian Arctic or wherever they're doing their rover testing to house equipment or even to live in.
Yes.
And they always have a domed top, as we can see there. Now, I'm not saying it's exactly like those. There might be different types of accommodation hub, right? Is it an accommodation hub of the Mars rover testing team?
Yeah.
Or is it a protection for some sort of satellite dish?
Yeah. I mean, you could make a number of sort of guesses as to what it might be. And I think the frustrating thing, again, is that we don't, if you write to somebody at NASA and ask for an explanation of what that is, you generally don't get a response, or you'll get, I don't know, I mean, maybe I'm being unfair, but the explanations I've received for some of these images which show structures certainly have not been satisfactory to me, and none of them have come from NASA.
Right. The next section, which I've left in from the previous hypothesis, which I'll skip over because we've already been through it, is just this image which appears to show anomalies in the dust on the solar panels, which one of them coincidentally is the same size and shape as a thumbprint.
Yeah.
So we're saying that there's no way that once the things left the Earth that someone could come and leave their thumbprint in the dust, and the dust is clearly being created after the things left the Earth.
Yes.
So it's not possible to get a thumbprint in there.
Yes. And there's actually another image which is from either the Spirit or Opportunity mission where there appears to be a footprint. It's near where the rover landed, and you see the rover's turned back to look at where the landing package has kind of unfurled itself, and there's what looks like a footprint in the soil, or a boot print, I should say, rather than a footprint.
Right.
That is also an intriguing image.
Right. Perhaps I can add that to the hypothesis because I wasn't aware of that one. Again, we've covered the colours argument in a previous show, but just to quickly skim through it, that was the first image which came back from the Viking mission, nice blue sky and slightly reddish sort of soil, and they said, oh, we made a mistake, it should have looked like that.
Right.
So they've used a false colour image in the second image for some bizarre reason. As I say, we've been through the colours, and the scientific reason for colouring these images is because you can examine the geology or other features using filters or colour substitution rather than using a true colour image. That's their excuse
that's
for
their basic argument.
99% of the images coming back with this red tinge to them.
Yes.
And we can see here in some of these images, people have actually corrected the colours to show you what the sky really should look like in these images. And again, in the hypothesis, I say, well, haven't they just taken a photograph on Earth and they've added a red colour on it to make it look like an alien planet?
Yes.
That to me seems like using Occam's razor.
I mean, I spoke about this several years ago, and I was really coming at it from the angle of the rovers really were on Mars and they were covering up that it was like the Earth. So I hadn't at that point considered, again, as we were saying earlier, like some of the other researchers, I hadn't considered that they faked the rover missions and the rovers were really on Earth. And again, we've still got some more stuff to go through about the engineering problems and so forth.
Now, I'd just like to point this one out, which was highlighted in A Fossil Hunter's Guide to Mars. They've not only used the wrong colours in this image, they've destroyed some of the detail apparently. This is the caption. NASA's press release version of Burns Cliff made using infrared as a colour and destroying the contrast and image sharpness. The sky has been literally erased and painted over, then blurred into the crater edge. There is no good technical or scientific reason for this representation. The colours are so far off that it barely qualifies as a picture of Mars. And this is what the image should look like. Okay, Burns Cliff, the true colour image. So why are they doing this to their images? Again, kind of the standard conspiratorial view is, they're covering up the fact that the skies are blue on Mars, but we're suggesting in the hypothesis, no, it's just that the thing's taken on Earth. Now, we've been through the impossible weather, and there's argument over whether there's water on Mars. And people have said that at certain temperatures and pressures you would get water or perhaps light rain or even ice and snow on Mars. So we go into it in detail in the hypothesis. So I'll skip past this part. You can look that up if you want to read it. You can download the hypothesis incidentally from this link. And anyone who wants to either add to it or come back with some comments to try and explain the evidence, because we're trying to build this hypothesis over a period of time into a piece of evidence. Now this image looks at what appears to be a fake sand dune. I discussed this one with Gary McKinnon. Did you look at this one, Andrew?
I did, yes, and it does look as if it's somehow being photoshopped or something. It's quite a dark image, I thought, and I didn't actually try and lighten it up myself. But it does look like some type of manufactured or photoshopped dune. Yeah, I'd agree. It does look a bit weird.
The question is, why do they need to do that? Why do they need to remove a large portion of the image and replace it with a fake sand dune? Is it covering up their bunkhouse?
Yeah, that's it. You know, again, you wonder, like the dome image we looked at a couple of minutes ago, you know, are they covering up something like that and airbrushing that out?
This program is sponsored by MouseMesh. If you're in the construction industry, we've introduced MouseMesh, inbuilt with interchangeable fronts, 6 different colours and stainless steel. This program is sponsored by MouseMesh. Our product has won several awards for innovation and concept. You don't need to kill mice and pests. You can stop them entering your home in the first place with MouseMesh.
Now we come on to the electronics, and this is something which we're in danger of the show becoming a nerd's paradise.
Indeed.
But this is something that Andrew and I are both very well qualified to look at, as you will see in a moment. This comes from a blog which you can look up online called the Astro Engineers blog from 2010. This was posted. I was only made aware of it maybe 8-9 months ago, something like that. It's a 14,000 word expose of someone's experiences while working for the Jet Propulsion Labs on the Curiosity system. In particular, these 2 guys were software engineers, or appeared to be software engineers, certainly had good knowledge of the software of the Curiosity rover. As I say, 14,000 expose of their explanation of what happened when one of them started to investigate a problem on the Curiosity rover. Now, do you want to explain it?
Yeah, I mean, it was very interesting. I wasn't aware of this until we discussed this interview about a week ago or so, or something, probably less than that. So I read through this thing and I looked at it initially and I thought, oh no, it's too long to read now. But but as I began to read it, as you said, being a bit of a nerd myself, I was kind of drawn into it. And the discussion struck me as very authentic, and I couldn't really, it mentions things like aspects of Unix and Linux, which are operating systems, which seemed to me totally legitimate, and the way that they described the fault finding that they were essentially doing was also, it just seemed exactly the way I would have done it. And the guy that was doing this initial fault finding was clearly very competent and very knowledgeable and highly skilled in what he was doing, and the way his friend describes their working relationship will also, I mean, I've experienced working relationships like just as he described in the work that I've previously done. And it's almost like when you read this blog, it's almost like you're working with them because it's very well written. And I couldn't find any, I did sort of stop halfway through and I'm thinking, well, is somebody just spinning a good yarn here? But it really, to me, by the time I got to the end, I did think it's probably a genuine account.
Right.
That what they'd written to me did seem to be genuine.
Right.
And the scenario is that they were basically looking into a scenario where one of the rovers had failed to respond to a command which had been given to it. And this is flagged up automatically as something that needs to be investigated by, the techie guys. So they did what's called a memory dump, where they actually saved out a portion of the rover's memory, the RAM, to look at what software was actually running at the time this fault occurred. And they talk about reverse engineering the assembler language back into C code.
Decompiling.
Exactly, yes. So that they could then work out what had caused this fault or what software was running when this fault happened.
I think he was able to then work out the C code.
Yeah,
right.
That's right.
So he could then actually
go back to the source code that they had and work out which module and which application, which subroutines were actually running.
Yeah.
And during the course of that analysis, they found some code which had been loaded into the RAM, which they didn't recognize. And looking at the memory mapping within this code, it appeared to be talking to another module. And these modules have a particular I/O address, input-output address in the system. And so when they looked into that, and they had all the specs for the rovers and how they worked and how the systems worked, and you've put some more of that in the hypothesis, haven't you, about the VX works and the VME bus, which is what you worked with in your work. And so they then, after a period of, I think, a couple of weeks at looking at this in their spare time, sort of under the table, so to speak, they worked out that what appeared to be happening was this code was talking to another radio module. And further to that, they were able to retrieve some of the data which this radio module had been working with. And it turned out that they were able to actually save out some of this data, and it turned out to be thumbnail images, which are these little versions of images that you see on a digital camera. When you have taken a load of pictures and you want to look at the preview, you see these tiny little images. They're called thumbnails, and this is what they were able to retrieve. And then after several weeks, maybe a couple of months, they actually went to the length of taking the thumbnails that they'd managed to retrieve from the analysis that they'd done and comparing those with other thumbnails which are already on their image database.
Well, they did a scan of the whole JPL network. One of them had access to other departments within JPL because he was an administrator of some kind, and they generated their own thumbnail, and then which had specific characteristics within it because it was generated using this specific function, and then they did a scan comparing it, and they found some thumbnails would have been generated with the same code.
That's right.
So someone in the JPL company had access to this secret code that was running in the Curiosity rover. So,
I think it was the Opportunity or the Spirit, wasn't it?
Yes. It wasn't Curiosity.
It was either the Spirit or the Opportunity.
Correct.
So they done that, and then they actually found where these, shall we say, secret or rogue thumbnail images, whatever you want to call them, these clandestinely retrieved thumbnail images, they found where they were stored. And they were stored, what was the name of that group that they were stored?
I've got it in here.
And they were basically stored in another office, which was a couple of buildings away from where they worked, or maybe even another site, but it was the quantum...
Yeah, there was a department in JPL, which in this group does exist.
Just search for quantum if you haven't got it.
Yeah.
Control F, quantum.
Control
F for find. Yeah. And then just search for quantum, because I forget, that was the first word, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And if it was like quantum...
Yeah, so there's a department in JPL called Quantum Sciences and Technology, and they had these images on one of their systems.
Yes.
So they then started to eavesdrop on part of their network and found that they were in communication with the one of the rovers in real time.
Correct.
In other words, normally it would take between 6 and 20 minutes to get a message to and then back from the rover because it's on Mars. But they were communicating with it
in real time. And they worked that out from the timestamp of the images and the way they could tell that these images had a timestamp coming from the rover, and they can compare that with when the actual file had been saved on their system.
And this is the key, folks. The conclusion that these guys come to, they said, well, this department, Quantum Sciences and Technology, have obviously developed faster than light radio communications.
Yeah.
So that's how they're able to get this back door into the rover. And functionally what was being done to the rover is someone was previewing images, deleting some of them and modifying some of them. Yes, they were using a specific function to change the image or to delete image. So just to expand on that, there's an extra device on the rover that no one knows about, that the computer system is communicating with surreptitiously, and someone is accessing thumbnails via that link. They're reviewing them in some way and they're deleting certain images. So there's a third party got a backdoor into the rover, right? And these two engineers, because they, in my opinion, because they're so convinced that the thing's on Mars, they say, well, the only thing we can think of is that this secret department have got faster than light radio comms.
Yes, yeah. And it kind of, when you know, from coming out from our perspective, it kind of makes you chuckle, as we're chuckling now when you read it, because the guys don't really give a reason as to why, you know, they would employ this faster than light communications.
An explanation which is just as plausible, more plausible in my opinion, is that the thing's on the Earth and it's been communicated via some low-flying satellite.
But I mean, even if we take their explanation as being the correct one, you know, unusual though it is, it clearly, you know, provides some sort of scenario where, or it suggests, I should say, it suggests a scenario where the images are being previewed, they are being pre-examined before being dealt with in some other way. So that in of itself is significant.
And just to go into a little bit of the electronics, as Andrew mentioned, this rover uses what's called a VME backplane. Now, I've worked with them for over 10 years in my work at Rolls-Royce and other companies, and this is it's industry standard, right? It's not something which is it's industry standard, right? It's industry standard electronics. The main processor module in the rover, it is ruggedized, so it's more robust than something you'd get in a power station or something like that, but they're using the same backplane, which I found quite interesting. Now, normally in VME systems, you would have spare slots, so it's a bit like your computer, which has PCI slots. You normally have one or two spare in case you want to monitor something, or you could do development with that spare slot. You could use it for anything.
That's right.
And is it the case that the rover in question, I think it was the Spirit rover, does have a single, perhaps redundant slot, spare slot, and all they've done, when they've taken the rover out, the rocket, it's gone to the rover test site, and all they've done is pushed another card into the rack and then added a radio transceiver that the card is talking to. And that would be a piece of cake. But one thing you would have to do to get that to work, you'd have to, as Andrew said, you'd have to modify the software in the main processor in order to communicate via the VME bus, which is what these engineers realized. So someone's added a bit of code and a bit of hardware so that the thing can be controlled and the images can be deleted via a radio link. Now, that radio link could easily be sent to a local satellite dish, and they could be sitting in the next office at JPL. So you've got one department who are getting the images and they think they're coming from Mars, and there's another department over the road who know it's on the Earth who are accessing the images in real time and deleting the ones they don't want them to see.
And you know, you could also argue that some of the artifacts that we've seen, perhaps those are being inserted, you know, they're inserting some of those into the image set to make people like us raise some of these questions. Who knows?
Yeah, it's but if you've got nerd leanings, then you'll
enjoy reading this. If you're a bit of a techie software person, you know, you can form your own judgment of this. But I couldn't find any flaws in it, and it's quite a sad story as well, because at the end of this, the guy who's written the story, he describes this scenario where the computer that he was using gets it gets broken into, doesn't it? The lid gets taken off. So he gets spooked by this. And although he's not found out and he's not taken aside by anyone at NASA, he decides to jump ship. And the friend that he was working with, he basically never speaks to him again, because he doesn't want to think that they will, if they're together.
Because what happens is it's when they start spying on this other department to see if they are communicating via this protocol. Someone's obviously picked up on that, and when he's gone home at night, there's a tech come in, removed his hard drive, copied all the data off it, put it back in, but they'd put one of the power cables in wrong.
Wrong way around, yeah.
Because he'd been in it the previous
yeah.
day, and he knew someone had been in and took his hard drive and then returned the hard drive. So someone was eavesdropping on him.
Yeah.
Eavesdropping on this other team, but nothing was done to reprimand him or anything.
No, he basically left NASA, the guy telling the story, he left NASA because he felt that they might catch up with him, so he just left. And I think he'd worked there for quite a number of years, and he was quite sad about that.
Another frustrating thing is it's an anonymous blog,
yes.
but there's a legitimate reason for that. You're not going to put your name to that for obvious reasons. They will have signed the Official Secrets Act.
Yeah, yes, indeed. And I did wonder, as I said earlier on, whether it was just a good yarn. But having read the whole thing and considered the circumstances,
it could be disinformation, but
it could be.
It's not. It's something which is. It's not on some major website. No one's picked up on it that I'm aware of.
Yeah. And I mean, remember this is dated 2010, so this is before Richard and I started considering these scenarios where the rovers are not on Mars. Way before, it was 3 years or so, 4 years before that. So
2010.
It's not like we've been fed this as disinformation because,
Yeah. Now we'll just briefly mention the landing, particularly of Curiosity, because when these rovers are sent to Mars, they have quite a payload.
Several tons, isn't it?
The whole thing put together, especially in Curiosity rover, it's got a heat shield and it's got the parachute mechanism, and it's got this thing which lowers it down and then on strings, and then it gets these thrusters then fire it off. So it weighs a lot.
I think it's about a ton for the actual Curiosity rover itself. I think nearly a ton, isn't it?
So the speed that it comes into the Martian atmosphere is phenomenal, and that the energy for that has to be dissipated or has to be accounted for somewhere. So there's a chap done quite a lot of calculations on this, which again, it's nerdy perhaps. If you're a nerd mechanical engineer, then you can download this.
You'll like it.
You'll like it. But he reckons there's just no way the thing could dissipate the amount of energy that it has to.
That's right, because we don't want to go too much. It's better if you read the document to get the technical detail. But in essence, what happens is everyone's seen a shooting star at one time or another, which is a piece of dust burning up in the atmosphere. The Curiosity rover in the packaging is like a giant shooting star, and it's travelling at high speed when it gets to the atmosphere. So the basic problem is, how do you stop it burning up before it lands? And as people will probably realise, you have to have a heat shield. So the document that Richard put together includes these calculations about how the heat shield can do its job and basically dissipate the energy from the high speed of travel, successfully. And there are certain basic calculations that you can make about the material, and he basically comes to the conclusion in this document that from the amount of heat that this would have to dissipate, it was like factors of probably hundreds or tens of thousands even, times the amount it would need to be he calls it infinitium or something, this material or something.
And the other aspect, Andrew, is the parachute, where he's currently doing calculations on the parachute for both Spirit and Opportunity and Curiosity. He suspects there's problems with that as well. Now we've mentioned the Curiosity rover team in the press conference. If you want to watch it, just go online and have a look for the Curiosity rover press conference and see if you think these engineers really are capable of getting an object to Mars, landing it on the surface, and then communicate back with Earth. And here's them in the control room, Andrew. I don't know what they're all doing here because, as I said, it takes between 6 and 20 minutes for the signals to get to and then back from Mars. So they can't possibly be controlling the mission in any way. It's all got to be automatic. So what are they doing in this room? But let's just take a look at this. This is the moment where the first thumbnail comes back, Andrew.
EDL ops, the signal to Odyssey remains strong.
Flight EDL images are starting to come down. We're beginning to get images,
We got
from
images
Odyssey.
coming down, folks.
If your comm configures stand by for images. Reader has
Seeing
cam
thumbnails
images.
coming down.
Odyssey data is still strong.
Odyssey data is very strong.
Odyssey is nice and high in the sky. At this time, we're standing by for images.
Thumbnails are complete. Got thumbnails.
Full image complete. Full image complete.
It's the wheel. It's the wheel.
There we go. We can see a wheel image. We are wheels down on Mars.
Oh my God. We'll do a proper hug on the other side.
Okay, so that was NASA receiving the first thumbnail from Curiosity. And it's obviously from Mars, isn't it? You can tell 64
Clearly.
pixels by 64 pixels.
As
so
many as that?
yeah,
Well, it
as
must
many as
clearly
that.
be, yeah.
It's obviously on Mars, isn't it?
It must be, yeah, 64 by 6. That's much higher resolution than I was expecting from
Yeah.
NASA.
All right. Now, I've been in communication with NASA. I wrote them a Freedom of Information request because what I'm interested in as a former engineer, I'm fairly well up on how products get tested. And something like a Mars rover would have batteries and batteries of tests, and there would be environmental testing and what I call soak testing, where the product is put in a working environment at its working temperature, the environment at the working temperature and pressures, etc., and its functions are operated over a long period, a period which is comparable to its life. So I would expect a rover to have at least a month worth of environmental testing, where it's at those low temperatures for a month. And every day they're waking it up and they're moving it about and they're doing tests and they're seeing if it will function throughout that whole month. So I want to see the document from NASA which lists all of those tests. You know, it's probably going to be this thick. It's going to have engineers' signatures on it, and that's what I've asked NASA for. And they've asked me to be more specific about what I want. So I'm in email contact with someone from the JPL library, and I'm going to see if I can get that document because. What proves that the thing can work is not the design of it. It's the testing. That's the proof that it's fit for purpose. And also in the document, you can read the emails that I sent to Robert Manning, who was one of the chief engineers on the Curiosity rover program, who basically ran away from mine and Andrew's questions. He answered one question and then we didn't hear from him
I
again.
think he answered our questions because it was a case of mistaken identity, wasn't it? I think you'd explained that before.
Maybe.
Yeah, because he thought that it was another NASA person writing to him when actually it was...
Well, that was initially... there's two Robert Mannings in NASA.
Yeah.
I wrote to the wrong one, so this Robert Manning forwarded my email to the one I meant to send it to, and I think he felt obliged to reply the first time because it had come from someone else in NASA.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Is there anything else you want to add, Andrew, with regards to this?
Well, yeah. I mean, the whole thing you were saying right there about the you know, functional testing. I mean, something like the rover. You know, you've probably got a year of test work to be done at least. You know, like separate system tests, and then you have an integration test where you put all the modules together and check that it all works properly together. You know, as you say, you use environmental ovens and environmental enclosures to make sure it's going to work in those temperatures. You know, that's something I saw where I worked at Plessy. They had an environmental oven that they put all the components in.
I think they have shown the environmental test chamber. But I want to see details of all of the documentation.
The documents, wouldn't it, with the signatures and dates and so forth. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, because those documents are usually extremely specific. Because when you write a test procedure, right, you have to assume that the person who's carrying out the tests has no knowledge of the project, right? So you can hand that to any engineer, and it will give all of the parts lists.
Yeah.
With the numbers and that you can go and get them out of the stores or whatever to build the rig and put it. This is the type of chamber you need. Everything listed. The capability of the oscilloscopes that you need. That's all the parts you need. Right. Instruction 1. Put this board on there. So it's like noddy.
Yeah.
It's like so the actual procedure for carrying out a test is normally extremely well defined.
Yes.
Because you have to be able to repeat. They might have to repeat it in 5 years' time when people have left.
That's right.
So
that's right.
it's the documentation. Why can't that be made public? Because I'm not aware that it is public. There's nothing secret in a test.
No. I mean, it's a publicly funded project, and it doesn't. I don't think there's that much technology that's patented, etc.
Incidentally, perhaps viewers can help me with just before we finish, Andrew. Just one thing I want to point out, and that is the VME rack, which I suspect is probably ruggedized to a degree. It's probably not an industry standard type VME rack. It'll have some sort of more protection on it, but the architecture electronically will be the same. And I'm saying, is there a free slot where an extra card could have been put in? I've not been able to find any photographs of the VME rack on Spirit and Opportunity rovers. Right? I've found photographs of every other component, the cameras, the arms, the solar panels, the power system. I've not found any images of the VME rack, which is the box of electronics which controls the rover. I've done Google searches, no photographs of it.
It could use a sort of more highly integrated version of the VME bus, that wasn't with the same pinout to save space or something like that.
Well, as far as I'm aware, it's not. It's just a standard VME bus, and the card, which is a RAD 6000, which is a fairly standard processor, but it's bespoke.
Ruggedized, isn't it?
Yeah, it's all the components on it can withstand certain blasts of radiation, right? Now, there's plenty of photographs of the card which goes into the rack.
Right.
Right, the main processor card, because that's used on other satellites.
That's right.
It's not just used on the rover.
Probes,
In fact, it's been used on quite a lot of space technology, that RAD 6000. But no photographs of Spirit Opportunity electronics rack. I want to see a photograph of that rack, and I want to see is there room for another card? Yeah. All right. Remember, believe none of what you hear and only half of what you see. I'm Richard D. Hall. Good night.
This program was sponsored by MouseMesh. Problem: mouse in your home. Reaction: solution: MouseMesh. Air brick covers can also be glued into place with our air brick adhesive. This program is sponsored by MouseMesh. Mice get into your home via the air bricks. MouseMesh is a humane alternative to preventing mice and other unwanted guests from entering your home.
Welcome to RichPlanet TV. I'm Richard D. Hall. It really is difficult to keep up with all of the alleged carnage being reported in mainstream media recently. My advice is don't believe any of it unless you are 100% sure you have seen solid evidence of every single claim. I communicated with Neil Sanders recently, and he has reported on a GCHQ policy which sets out a strategy to plant false stories on the internet with the aim of misleading researchers. In other words, your government is using your taxes to mislead you. Now, today I am launching a new film on DVD which can be pre-ordered from the website for dispatch on the 8th of August 2016. Unfortunately, I cannot say what the film is about. What I can say is it is 93 minutes long, it is not a new Madeline film, and it is not about UFOs, but that really is all I can say. All will become clear when you watch it. So if you want to order the mystery film for dispatch on the 8th of August, please follow this link. All will be revealed then. As many viewers know, I have researched the Mars rover program with a very critical eye, and I conclude that the evidence does not convince me that the Mars rovers are on Mars. I suspect they may have never left the Earth. I recently spent some time updating my hypothesis document, which is now some 100 pages long. On today's show, I discussed the new hypothesis with Andrew Johnson. The jury is very much still out on this one. Warning, this show has quite a high nerd rating. But that's okay, because I suspect there are many RichPlanet viewers who might be described as closet nerds. We've discussed some of NASA's projects at length on RichPlanet in previous shows, including the Mars rover program. These are unmanned robots which, according to NASA, are roaming around the surface of Mars and occasionally sending back pictures. In 2014, I published a paper entitled The Mars Rover Hypothesis, which examines whether or not the Mars rovers really are on Mars and evidence suggesting they possibly never left the Earth. I have recently updated the hypothesis with significant new evidence, and here to discuss the work is RichPlanet stalwart Andrew Johnson. Welcome, Andrew.
Thanks for inviting me, Richard.
Now then, when I put this hypothesis out, and people can see our interviews from these links on the screen, and they can download the new hypothesis from the link on the screen, I was contacted by two scientists, and they went through a lot of the evidence in the document, and they were casting doubt over a lot of the evidence. So what we're going to do first is just look at some of the evidence that we put forward, or I put forward. Also to mention Douglas Gibson, he's been involved in this research as well, that we think now is probably not so strong, or has been taken out of the hypothesis altogether. Because I've listed some of the evidence that's been removed from the hypothesis because it's effectively been explained. The first was the moving artifacts.
Only black and white.
Another image which I've taken out of the main hypothesis and moved into the appendix, but still in the document, was what we've termed the walrus arm bone, which a close-up, we'll just put that on the screen, looks at first sight very much like a bone. Again, one of the scientists that contacted me actually did a calculation on the size, and he pointed out quite rightly that one of the first things you should try and do is ascertain what is the size of the thing that you're looking at.
Yes, indeed, yeah.
And he did that by looking at the imprints of the tyres, well, they're not tyres, the wheels.
The wheels, yeah, with
of the rover.
Yeah.
75 millimeters, as we see there. So the item in the image there is probably, maybe I would say, less than 7.5 centimeters long. So it's not
big enough for a
walrus. A walrus. So and he actually said in his text, and don't even go down the avenue of calling it a baby seal bone, right? But if we look at a wider shot of that, I think I'm inclined to accept this, that there are lots of fragments of rocks of all different kinds of random shapes, and they clearly are rocks in that image. So I'm happy to accept that may just be a rock and not a bone. So as I say, they've been moved into the appendix. There's many changes to this document. Some of it as a result of the information given to me by these two scientists. I've added some new sections into the hypothesis, Andrew. I'll just run through them. Microbial life images, ventifacts, and unexplained features, sand dunes, LiDAR, radio signals, and the landing. Another thing that I've taken out is I was comparing the Spirit and Opportunity rovers with
Mobility scooters.
A mobility scooter. And it was pointed out that, well, mobility scooters are designed to travel several miles in one charge,
Yes.
whereas the rover will only go a few meters. It moves very short distances. Now, there's a lot of hardware on these rovers, and if you were to operate them all simultaneously, it would be quite a load. But I understand that it's done in a very conservative fashion. So the amount of current or power that the devices draw, including the motors on the wheels, is very small relative to a mobility scooter. So they're
Yes.
saying it's not a fair comparison.
Yeah.
So I've taken that comparison out. But I do still ask questions about whether the lithium-ion batteries that are on Spirit and Opportunity could have really lasted for 10 years without having significant reduction in performance.
Yes, indeed. And I mean, we can, point out that the conditions on Mars, according to what we're told, rather more hostile to battery technology than they are on Earth. So, a laptop battery, as you say, lasting 10 years on Earth. I mean, a laptop doesn't draw that much current. So, but yet a laptop will only last for 5 minutes when the battery is, basically no good.
Mm-hmm.
So how are these lasting on a charge from solar panels, which are, that much further away from the sun, etc., etc.?
All right, well, we come to another photographic image, which is PIA 16204. And as soon as you see this image, you think, well, that's some kind of rodent. It's a lemming, or it's what have you. Now, both the scientists said that they thought it was just a rock that had caught the light in a certain way to make it look like that. Now, interestingly, one of these scientists was able to give me another high-definition image of that group of rocks on a different day, about 3 weeks apart, from a different image. This was a photograph, we can see it here in the image, where it appeared that some of the rocks were in different positions in different images. And it was shown fairly easily that this was just due to parallax, a parallax problem with the camera. The other piece of evidence, which I've completely removed from the hypothesis, was an image called the Self-Portrait of Curiosity.
Yes.
And this is because the image, it does seem to have been stitched together from a mosaic of lots of other images.
Yes.
So what was suggested was, well, how could something possibly take a photograph of itself?
Yes.
Now, perhaps still in the ambiguous category, but I've moved these two images to the appendix. So they're not part of the main hypothesis, but I've left them in there. The first one is the piece of wood image, which I know that you're familiar with.
Yes, indeed.
So if you just remind us about that image, Andrew.
Yes, well, I mean, when I first saw this image a few years ago, it did, to me, look like a plank of wood, basically, that had kind of partly rotted, and that was primarily because of its shape and the texture of it and the length of it, and it did seem to have squared off edges. But I think from what you'd put in the document there are some additional segments of that same image, just I think a few sort of feet away, aren't there, where you're seeing similar features.
Yeah, so we see there a much wider image of the landscape where there appears to be other objects which have the same surface texture.
Yes.
Right, to the right there, which isn't the same shape with squared off edges. So
right. So it could just be that it's happened to be a lump of rock that's broken off of that, which looks like a 3x2 lump of wood. But again, what we can say is that we know that these rover images are capable of taking colour pictures, and this discussion that we're having now would have been aided by having a colour picture, because then if it were, we could see whether it was wood coloured or whether it was less wood coloured, but we can't because it's